then I think our angle, and I don't know what your angle was with her, but I can have a guess. It's always just like, of course, there are loads of upsides to being in the public cloud, both in terms of being asset light, in terms of the tools they give you, in terms of the scalability and flexibility and agility and all that. But let's not lose sight of the vulnerabilities. Sorry.
Well, I think I agreed with her on some of those points. I mean, we have more perhaps in common than she might.
Because we'd be stupid to be totally hostile to it.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that I have is.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We're having to wing it once more. I'm back from the Canaries with a bit of a tan, which isn't bad going, given that I was it was quite cloudy and I was working and all that sort of thing. But
sort of reddy brown.
Yeah, reddy brown. Yeah. I'll take that.
I just go red.
You just go red, do you? You got that sort of Northern European complexion. But Pierre is in France, I believe, on half term. So that's why we're doing this one remotely. But me and Ian thought we'd come into the studio for a couple of reasons. One, we haven't seen each other. We miss each other, don't we?
We do.
And then we also miss having a couple of beers after.
Mm-hmm. And
then also we had to pick up the whole box, but there's a big Beavertown box that was delivered to us by one of the podcast fans who I'll remain anonymous because I think that's how they prefer it. But thanks a lot. You know who you are. And so we had to come in and pick up the Beavertown. So I'll put some on ice, Ian. Do you want to start medium, full on, hazy?
Go for a hazy.
Go for a hazy to start.
Work myself into it after a heavy night.
Yeah. Okay.
On the San Miguel.
What were you up to? Are you allowed to say?
Yeah, it's not a secret. I met up with one of our freelancers, Ken Whelan.
Oh yeah,
who I hadn't seen since
legend of the telecoms industry.
Exactly, I hadn't seen him since.
Oh shit! No, this is Gamma Ray. What have you got?
You got bones.
Oh, you got bones. Like I fucked up the. No, don't you want that? I fucked up the filing. Do you want a Gamma Ray to get started?
I'll have a Gamma Ray.
I'll deal with your hangover.
Yeah. I hadn't seen Ken since.
Oh, here's the haze. All right.
I hadn't seen Ken since Mobile World Congress, so I thought it was time to do a bit of team bonding.
Okay.
Obviously talking about important work matters.
Yeah.
As well as having a few San Miguels.
Team, I'm gonna stick a couple more on ice just in case. Although we won't get through them, will we? We only got about an hour. But better safe than sorry, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. And you had quite a few, did you?
Yeah, I didn't plan it to be a heavy night, but it turned into one. 5 or 6.
So off on the way.
Lager just does you in, doesn't it? Do you notice that? I don't feel very well on lager the next day.
Yeah, I mean the only flip side of that is, I found. You remember just before we went away, we went and had some beers with Ben and Hazel from Huawei, and Hazel and they were buying us these Steins.
Yeah,
we're like a Munich beer hall themed thing in Victoria, and they're buying us these massive Steins, and Hazel was who's considerably smaller than I am, was sort of marveling at the volume, and I went, to be honest, Hazel, I think I can drink just normal strength beer almost indefinitely, and not get too fucked up, because the trade-off between the volume and the amount of alcohol, as soon as you start doing shots or wine or even like Gamma Ray level lager, then it all starts going Pete Tong pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But anyway, cheers. Thanks, anonymous supporter. You're very generous. We love you.
Cheers.
So we've got to keep it short and sweet. I wanted to very quickly. I was reading about Pierre's going to hate me for this because it's got fuck all to do with telecoms. But I was reading about this Trump trial on the way in, and I just thought it's worth mentioning, just because most objective people realize that this is like vexatious lawfare, and it's all very sort of strategic, and they're basically corrupting the legal system in order to dispose of a political opponent.
Are they?
Yeah. You don't reckon that?
Well, I mean, there seems to be it's hard to say either way, isn't it? There seems to be quite a lot of evidence of wrongdoing by him.
Well, I think most people, like legal experts, of which I'm not one, but legal experts I've listened to, reckon that the supposed crimes themselves, there's no precedent for them, and they're at best misdemeanors. They're like bookkeeping errors and that sort of thing.
Right.
And it's also a state court basically operating on a sort of federal level. There's all sorts of novel things that have been done that seem to be done uniquely to deal with Donald Trump. Anyway, the thing that's slightly interesting, they're not telecoms, but of greater interest in a broader geopolitical sense, is I just think things like this are going to make the US even more of a basket case politically and possibly even civilly for a while. Because if Trump wins, he's basically going to spend 4 years going after everyone who's gone after him.
Yeah.
Because he's a sort of narcissistic megalomaniac, and that's what he'll do. He won't take this shit lying down. If he doesn't win, all the people who fancy Trump are going to cry foul even more than they did 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And perhaps more importantly, even than that, is, if you accept my premise that where I framed the whole vexatious legal stuff, is they've completely corrupted due process. And so they sort of lowered the bar for all sorts of supposedly trusted and incorruptible institutions. And the problem with that is once you lower the bar like that, then your opponents, when they get the opportunity, they're going to do the same shit to you. And there's supposed to be a certain level where we go, look, even though we're going to go out hammer and tongs and we're going to pull out all the stops to win and to defeat my opponent, there's supposed to be a certain base level you won't go below. And it feels like that bar is getting lower and lower. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. I think it's interesting because the news only broke last night. But I think it's also interesting just, for people who aren't plugged in, just watch this space because the US is just going to go absolutely bonkers, even more so. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Sorry, Pierre. And by the way, for those watching, you'll notice that the novel technique we've tried is Ian's laptop with both of us just sat next to each other. Because we miss each other so much, we actually need physical proximity after 2 weeks.
Well, there was no other way to do it, really. Either,
no.
So.
I thought of trying to do us both on separate laptops with headphones, but Pierre, I'm sure quite rightly, figured that the audio on that would be a fucking nightmare. So anyway, we better crack on. Obviously, I'm back from the Canaries. I don't have much to report. I haven't been up to much since then. Have you been up to anything in the last week?
Work-wise, not really. It's very quiet at the moment, isn't it? I've noticed.
In terms of stories and general activity?
The news flow is quite quiet itself.
Yeah, except you keep getting invited to call shit and I don't. I won't even name them because I don't want to be vindictive like Donald Trump will be.
Yeah.
But yeah, you seem to be on a lot more summer larks invite lists than I do. I mean, what did I do? Did I get really drunk and just fucking abuse people one time?
I don't know.
I mean, I wouldn't put it past myself.
But yeah, there's been some.
I got to tell you a story about what I got to Wednesday after we went out when we last saw each other.
On the
after that, on the way home.
No, I think the news flow is fairly quiet at the moment, and it's going to pick up again, I suppose, round about Copenhagen. The time
going on there.
The TM Forum's big annual shindig.
It's only a couple of weeks away or something.
It's only a couple of weeks away, and it's a bigger event than it was a few years ago.
Yeah.
And taken more seriously.
Yeah. Well, and one of the reasons it's bigger is because of all the cloudy stuff, which we'll get onto in a sec.
Two things: cloudy stuff, and related to that, AI.
Yeah,
I think are the two.
All they're going to bang on about this year, isn't it? AI.
Probably there'll be some stuff probably about things like APIs.
Yeah, they're more sort of traditional areas.
Yeah, exactly. But
and we'll hear about catalysts, and we'll go. As usual, we'll go, that's great. I'm really pleased for you.
I've never ever been to one of the catalysts or demos. I have to say. It's.
I mean, I get that it's a very in the weeds thing. So people who don't know much about TM Forum that runs Digital Transformation World and Catalyst and all that, they've been an organisation going longer than I think I've been doing this job. They've been going for ages, haven't they?
Yeah.
And they've always just viewed themselves as one of the
handed down through the generation.
Yeah, that's true. Willits,
yes.
His dad, and now it's Junior,
which is a terrible example of nepotism, it seems. Although he's actually been very good.
It does seem to have been pretty decent at it. Yeah. I think he could, as I said to some contention last year, I think he could make the keynotes a bit less corporate and a bit more chatty. But there we go.
Possibly.
But yeah, no, I agree. He seems to have done a great job, and certainly the event goes from strength to strength. I agree with that. But yeah, they sort of view themselves as in the middle. I think it was originally like a sort of BSS OSS thing. It's just basically all the software, all the plumbing, as I call it, the stuff that makes telecoms work. They are there as a sort of forum for interoperability and just getting all these bits and bobs to work better with each other. And then certainly since the pandemic, it obviously went away for a couple of years, as did all other events during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And it came back, and the first time it came back, it's quite obvious that the hyperscalers were much more center stage, AWS, Microsoft, Google Cloud, all that. And that's just going more and more because those hyperscalers are the ones that are dominating AI, which is the buzzword du jour. In fact, given that we haven't got much time, we should just pick that opportunity to get straight into the first thing we're going to talk about, which is something I read that you covered.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really interesting because you dug up something where the initial premise wasn't really new, but your news analysis with a telecoms context was new. So your headline was Google's Uni Super Snafu. And for non-Americans, snafu is technically an abbreviation, but you chose to put it lowercase. For non-Americans, that means situation normal, all fucked up. It's just like an American, like a military language, isn't it?
It is. I don't know if people normally do it in caps.
Has it become so normal that it's lowercase now? Okay, fair enough.
It's almost like a word itself.
Fair enough. Snafu, yeah,
just a fuck up.
So no one, a lot of people don't even know what it originally stood for.
It's like okay. I mean, that is uppercase still, but people don't really know the origins of it.
What are the origins?
I think it's all cool or something, is it? I can't, clear or something like that. And it's got for some strange reason it got, and again I think it was a military thing. All clear, but
zero kill. What the fuck are you talking about, Pierre?
Something is something else. Okay.
Zero kill.
You have to come on and explain now.
Yeah. All right. Okay, that's another one. There's another one actually that coincides with Pierre's world that always makes me laugh is Mayday.
Right.
So Mayday is what people say when they're in trouble on a ship or something.
Yeah.
And it originally comes from French for help me, Mayday. Did you know that?
No.
All right. And there was a funny thing. One of my favorite comedy programs, Red Dwarf, where one of the characters in it was going Mayday, Mayday, and he goes, "Why do we pick bank holidays?" And he started going, "Easter Sunday, Easter Sunday." Anyway, so yes, Google's Uni Super Snafu was a public cloud warning to telcos. So I will not bury the lead any further. Tell us about that story, Ian.
Yeah, well, this was earlier in the month when Unisleep is like an Australian pension fund worth about 125 billion, I think.
Right.
And it basically there was a configuration error, I think, and it resulted in it essentially disappearing.
Right. So
the business company,
125 billion Aussie dollars.
Yeah.
Just fucking
just
up in smoke.
So these people who were sort of members of it were unable to sort of access records and see what was going on, and it was almost like things vanished. I thought it was very much like those those sort of deep state films with Gene Hackman and Will Smith or something.
Oh right, yeah, where they steal your identity and you can't do anything.
Yeah, exactly. You're like you basically don't exist anymore because all these computer records.
I'm going to get you started on I'm going to get you started on the abolition of cash in a minute, and then you'll really get hot and sweaty.
This is what the cloud is. It's basically putting all these systems. It's like if you have all your important documents in life stored on your laptop, and you accidentally leave it on the train or drop it or get angry one day and decide to smash it up, sort of thing I'd do probably because I'm like that with technology.
You just get a red mist moment,
trouble, wouldn't you? Because you'd have,
yeah.
And the cloud is.
Well, I've always been aware of that with smartphones.
Yeah.
I mean, jeopardy that comes from like I was just traveling now. All my boarding passes are on my smartphone. Basically everything except my passport. I could, with the exception of passport now, I could leave the house with only my phone and be able to have a perfectly viable holiday.
Yeah. So it's obviously much safer than having all your documents on the on a laptop to put them in the cloud because then they're sort of backed up and they're in a data center somewhere and there's all these checks and balances and controls and it's looked after by experts, and if you destroy your laptop you can still access it from the cloud. But what happens if there's a problem with the cloud, which is kind of what's going to happen here. Now this isn't the first time it's happened, by the way. There were some outages, I think quite a few outages last year or the year before.
There have been periodic ones, none of them completely catastrophic, but often big enough to be like, oh, hello.
Yeah, I mean, this one seemed to last a few days, this Google Cloud Platform configuration error from the original reporting on it. It seemed to go on for a few days. The ones that happened when there were outages last year, which I think started with Akamai, was the first company.
I think a Cloudflare had an issue one time.
Cloudflare had an issue. Now, one thing you noticed then was they were only down for a few hours, but you couldn't access certain websites. including some quite well-known ones. I think like the Guardian newspaper, for instance, you just
Right.
couldn't sort of get onto it because they had this sort of relationship with one of these companies
Right.
that stopped you from being able to kind of get Guardian up on your
God.
now,
How were the lefties going to get their opinions?
well, this is the thing. It's like even a few hours, I suppose, for some of these companies that are dealing in large amounts of money from advertising revenues and stuff is probably quite. And for small
Yeah.
businesses, it's worse. You know, Facebook had problems, I remember, and Facebook. A lot of people make money out of Facebook. A lot of small, SOHOs they're called, aren't they? Small office, home office type work,
or even SMEs. But yeah, it probably is the smaller ones.
You know, they had an outage, and I mean, they're not a public cloud, obviously, but they have their big data centers, and it's a similar thing. You know, you have a problem, and it affects companies that rely on that platform. And it sort of occurred to me. I mean, I did get some messaging about it. You know, what if this was something that happened to a 5G core network rather than a pension fund?
Yeah. Well, quite.
Because obviously, I think people look at this sort of thing going on, and there's all this talk at the moment these days about putting telco functions into the public cloud.
Yeah.
We talk about this all the time.
Well, I saw your podcast with Danielle,
which is very much on
recently
on that subject.
Yeah.
In fact, I think I wrote this the same day that came out.
Okay.
I didn't do it to wind Danielle up.
She takes a bit of time. You recorded it a few weeks ago, didn't you?
She did. I think she has them sort of queued up.
Right.
And there's always a danger, I suppose, that stuff goes a bit.
But she has to make sure she edits out the shit that you say she doesn't like.
Yeah,
I'm joking, Danielle. I'm sure you don't do that.
I don't know how much editing went on. I've yet to listen to it in full, to be honest. So I don't know how much.
But yeah, you know, Danielle Royston, who's been on this pod a while ago and is still one of the best ever bribe of the weeks we've got, is the Yeti cooler that we're using right now but yeah, her thing, you know, the whole premise when we got her on the pod and she lent into it was that she's a cheerleader for telcos in the public cloud, and she brought little pom-poms and lent into the whole cheerleader thing, which I thought was very sporting of her.
Yeah.
But yeah, that always makes it interesting when you got someone who's set that out their stall and they're just all in. Then I think our angle, and I don't know what your angle was with her, but I can have a guess. It's always just like, of course, there are loads of upsides to being in the public cloud, both in terms of being asset light, in terms of the tools they give you, in terms of the scalability and flexibility and agility and all that. But let's not lose sight of the vulnerabilities. Sorry.
Well, I think I agreed with her on some of those points. I mean, we have more perhaps in common than she might.
Because we'd be stupid to be totally hostile to it.
Yeah, I think one of the issues I have is this notion that the public cloud is now being kind of broadly accepted and used by more and more telcos.
Right.
I still don't see it being something that a lot of telcos want to do. And I know there's been a few high-profile instances recently of people doing things and saying it's the public cloud, but I think it's fake public cloud, Scott.
What do you mean by that?
Cloud, as Donald Trump
like fake news.
Yeah.
You're a fake public cloud. Was that any good?
It was all right.
I don't know, somewhere between Donald Trump and Clint Eastwood or something.
Yeah, I think the big one this year, I think that everybody's paid attention to, was this Telefonica Germany arrangement, which I think initially got covered by Reuters. It seems like they got a sort of advanced sort of, you can speak with the relevant people.
I've got a bit of Reuters journalism coming up.
Yeah, and then the press releases got pushed out to everybody else, and that was a similar situation for me. Actually, I ended up covering it about a week later, but I did a bit of digging and found out a few other things, and ended up.
I think that's completely valid, by the way, as a sort of in the weeds journalistic thing, especially when things are quiet. Like the way we do news on Telecoms.com is I give Nick and Mary, our excellent freelance writers, first shout at the stories, then Andrew, and then I'll just try and make something of whatever the fuck is left. Yeah. And that often means I have to be a bit more creative.
Yeah.
And be a bit more news analysis and sort of manufacture a telecoms angle where there isn't.
You're almost making some news.
Yeah, exactly.
But I spoke at the time with AWS actually on that, and that's very much this arrangement. But what it is Telefonica Germany using AWS and Nokia for its 5G core, and very much promoting it as a public cloud deal. However, now strictly speaking, the public cloud means putting your network functions into a hyperscaler data facility.
Yeah.
That's used by multiple people, hence public cloud.
Yeah, in one of those fucking football pitch size data centers.
Where you have racks and racks of servers that are used by all sorts of organizations. And now this is where the economic benefits come in, because it's on a huge scale. you're basically sharing costs with other companies. You know, you're splitting the server costs, you're splitting the energy costs, all this sort of stuff, and that's why it's very hard for other people to compete with. And that's where the economic benefits come in. If you compare it with a private cloud, where it would just be your facility and it's only you that's kind of hosting stuff there off premises. Yeah. The issue that I have with the Telefonica and AWS Nokia arrangement is that it calls it a public cloud deal, and then in the press release itself goes on about how a lot of it's hosted on Telefonica facilities.
Right.
Now, unless those facilities
so it's a hybrid cloud.
So Microsoft would not call it a public cloud.
Yeah. Microsoft's the most honest about the hybrid.
Microsoft, if you said to Microsoft, is this a public cloud deal? If they'd done exactly the same thing, and they, by the way, did something earlier in the year with Etisalat, and they also have this arrangement with AT&T, those are their two sort of big telco customers for this kind of thing, they would say, and I know they'd say this because I've asked them, no, it's not a public cloud deal, it's a hybrid cloud deal. Some of the functions are in the public cloud, but some of them are on the, you know, in a private cloud.
I appreciate Microsoft's approach. Who was that geezer talking about DTW? Who was that geezer we both spoke to at the same time from Microsoft at DTW a year or two ago? Can you remember his name? Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Off the top of my head, I can't, but I don't know who you mean.
But I just thought, you know, I don't know whether or not he'd just been well briefed and he knew we were coming at it from a slightly cloud skeptical angle, but he was like, yeah, fair enough, it should be hybrid.
Yeah.
You know, things that are best done by us we'll do, and then we'll facilitate. And we had Sean, yeah.
I mean, we talked to Rick Liavano.
That's it. Yeah. So we've had Rick and Sean speaking.
There's also
that was really popular, that Sean podcast we did.
Yeah, there's whose name I can't remember, but the guy who's basically the boss of those two, I think.
Right.
Who I interviewed in advance of Mobile World Congress about the Etisalat deal.
Okay.
He was the person who said to me on the phone or on Zoom or whatever it was, this is not a public cloud deal. It's a hybrid cloud deal. There is an element of the public cloud in it, there's an element of the private cloud in it, hence hybrid cloud.
Totally.
Now, the problem is, and this is something that we should be asking these people a bit more about, I guess, is once it becomes a private cloud arrangement or a part private cloud arrangement, those economic attractions that get cited to do with the public cloud, i.e. splitting energy costs with other companies and it being on this kind of super scale because it's all in these massive facilities that they have, they go. Yeah, they're not there anymore. You're basically competing on the same playing field as somebody like a Red Hat or a VMware, presumably, or even a telco that decides.
I mean, it's a bit above my pay grade in terms of the technical side of it. But I mean, one thing that I think, again, Microsoft articulated quite well is if you're going to be one of the hyperscalers, and let's face it, it's dominated by three, certainly outside of China, which is AWS, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google Cloud, then Microsoft approach is going to be, presumably it's in their business, it's in their immediate business interest for you to put as much as possible onto their cloud, because then they get to charge whatever rent they charge. But they seem to be, at least this is their rhetoric, this is their spin. They seem to be playing a longer game, going, look, as long as they're engaged with us somehow, even if it's us sort of exporting our tools onto their private cloud, as long as we keep them keen, then that's probably the better way to just have that stickiness and maybe more revenue all in. So that's one approach. And one more thing about that that I appreciate, which I think is relevant to your story, is redundancy. So I suppose ideally what you would have, and again, I don't understand the technology well enough to know whether this is possible or whether it's already there, and what I'm saying is pointless. But what you'd have is maybe a lot of that day-to-day heavy lifting done on the public cloud, where they've got all this scale, but then a sort of redundant mirror of everything you do on your private cloud that you can sort of fall back onto as and when. And obviously that's more expensive, but it's the same concept as insurance, everything else, which is a sunk cost, but you still pay it because you're offsetting disaster. And
well, I don't know if they're doing that.
Yeah, that just makes sense from my layman, from my dilettante point of view.
I mean, I think that would wipe out the economic attractions completely if you've got duplication across the public and private cloud. I think you do one or the other, because if you've got a private cloud that's there as a backup, that you've still got to invest in the equipment that you need to support that. But
on their other advantages, for example, if Danielle or any other public cloud advocate was here, they talk about the scalability and the ability, the agility to wind up and wind down and all that stuff.
Yeah, I get that, but the point is that I'm not disputing the fact that these companies know what they're doing, and that there are other economies of scale that they realize through their technology stacks that can be applied when they're using it in a hybrid cloud setting. But the 2 points about sharing energy costs and sharing server costs and being in these, the big selling point of the public cloud being that it's shared infrastructure is not there, obviously. When
totally.
it might be there in part if it's a hybrid cloud because there's some element of the public cloud.
But the more you have private, the less.
The more you have private, the less of that there is. Now, the problem is not so much on the core side, I don't think, but the radio access network side is really, really hard to put on the public cloud. This is a case where...
and some bits will never, I mean, antennae, you still got to have physical antenna, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not talking about things like that. You can't put, you can't put masts in the cloud. But
so what do you mean then?
The network functions.
I see, right.
Software, the stuff that runs on the servers. You go and tour any mobile site today, and there's boxes at the bottom of the mast. That's the baseband. This is the stuff we talk about with Open RAN. You'll link between that and the antennas at the top, which runs over a fiber link, which is obviously very short in those cases because it's on the mast. The whole idea about sort of RAN centralization and putting these things into data centers, whether it's a private cloud facility or what gets called like a baseband hotel. We had that expression come up recently, I think, on the
well, since my baby left me.
I think I used it in there.
Okay, well, feel free to if there's a natural segue into your other piece of yours that we're going to discuss, feel free.
Yeah, I will. But the argument is that you can take those servers basically that host network functions, and instead of having them on the site itself, you can put them in aggregation points, which might be baseband hotels I love that. That just look after baseband servers and equipment, basically.
I'm just picturing like little baseband saunas.
Yeah.
Buffets and shit.
Or it could be you're not doing that at all, and you're using servers inside a hyperscaler facility. And you're running your network software there. Now, the reason that doesn't really work is there are all sorts of regulatory concerns, by the way, that are a barrier to the public cloud anyway in Europe. Because a lot of this is not to do with what the telcos want. It's governments saying we don't want this to be on the public cloud because they're concerned about security and redundancy and some of the things that we're worried about, actually, or that I'm worried about. But it also doesn't work technically. And Rick Leovano, having mentioned him, he said this himself when we met him 2 years ago, that you need a certain degree of proximity to end users, because otherwise your signal is having to do a long journey.
So it's the latency thing.
It's a latency issue. You can't have a radio access network that's a bunch of masts, antenna hosting masts up and down the country, and then all the compute and IT resources are in one big hyperscaler facility in that country.
And you get delays that just aren't going to work.
It just wouldn't work. So this is why with Open RAN, and more appropriately virtual RAN, which is essentially the cloudification of it. Even when that's happening, even when operators are using common software tools and common hardware platforms like Intel general purpose processors and all this stuff, and servers rather than appliances to host their network software, they're still often leaving them at the site. They're not aggregating them at all. So Vodafone's a case in point. Vodafone's swap out of Huawei, where it's switching to Samsung across about 2,500 sites in the UK. They're not centralizing those. Now, they might do in the future. I agree, but at the moment they're not centralizing those baseband boxes. They're leaving them at the site.
There's the stuff you're just talking about now. What led to this excellent subhead in your story: the loneliness of the long distance RAN.
Yeah.
Exactly. Were you tempted to just put ER at the end?
I was trying to figure a way of going RAN, and it just wouldn't work. So, and then I couldn't think of
what was that. I know.
I haven't seen the film, by the way.
No, well, I know it mainly because it's an Iron Maiden song. Iron Maiden, certainly in their pomp, would go off in all sorts of random tangents and sing songs about, like, they've got this really long song about the rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Right.
They're quite literate.
Yeah.
And they got one called Loneliness.
Better than what's it? Led Zeppelin, just like Lord of the Rings references, I think, didn't they? They even mentioned Gollum in songs.
Or Aerosmith, that basically just sing about getting their end away the whole time. and what big manhoods they have. Each to their own. But Iron Maiden is like ultimate geek music. That's where apparently the band that was most offended by Spinal Tap when it came out was Iron Maiden, because they had things like Stonehenge.
There's the baseband hotel reference.
There we are. Yeah. So that's under your loneliness of the long distance RAN.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, bringing it back. So what?
The other issue as well on the RAN, by the way, is now the point about the cloud is, and this is also where some of the economies of scale come in, is that when you're using, you're going from purpose-built equipment, so the kind of application-specific integrated circuits that someone like Ericsson might design, on custom-made appliances rather than servers.
You're
switching from that to Intel's CPUs and Dell servers. It gets called, what's the acronym? COTS, common off-the-shelf servers, basically.
Mm-hmm.
The idea, again, the rationale makes sense that this is a massive market then you're tapping into, and you can, in theory, use the same kind of equipment that gets sold to somebody like Walmart or McDonald's, yeah?
Yeah.
But the problem is,
and there's savings from that because
it's economies of scale. It's just a huge market that if it's all standardized equipment and just doing one type of processor and one type of server that suits everybody's needs worldwide, who's in the IT game and needs some kind of software supporting, it makes sense that it would drive down the unit
and
prices.
that's why companies like Intel are so keen, because the actual economics of the Intel business model is that they're primarily a manufacturer. And my understanding, again, the caveat of everything I say on this podcast is I don't really know what the fuck I'm talking about, but there we go. That doesn't stop me.
You're at the appropriate point
there we are.
Of the story.
So we're recording this on Ian's laptop, but I've got my lappy next to it. Is the manufacturing business model is a lot of capex to start with the plant and all that sort of thing, and then it's almost pure profit after that because you're churning out each unit at a fraction of a penny because nearly most of the cost has been in the capex of the plant, and so they want to put chips in fucking everything.
Yeah, and Intel's
they want to put chips in chips.
Intel's argument would be, and I've spoken to them about this, would be there's in the future when general purpose processors kind of catch up with purpose built stuff, these ASICs that Ericsson does, and they keep going on about it's closing the performance gap and it's getting better and better. There's no point really in Ericsson still doing this stuff because the economies of scale are so massive in the general purpose processor side that it's just going to be economically advantageous to go with the sort of Intel stuff instead, because it's just a much bigger market that they're serving. The size of the RAN market each year, 40 billion. That's overall product sales, 40 billion, versus what are chip sales altogether? About 600 billion a year, I think. How much is Intel making alone just from the sale of of stuff that it's using for general purpose? That it's putting general purpose processors,
servers and PCs and all that.
So I don't know what Intel's revenues are at the moment actually, but 40 billion. I don't know. They've come down a bit, but
my laptop, according to this sticker, has an Intel V Pro i5 in it.
Yeah, and so that's the argument. Now, the problem I have with it is that increasingly these bits of equipment that people are coming out with that they're calling general purpose processors, and it's mainly Intel, obviously, aren't really general purpose processors anymore. They include so much customization to handle the unique needs of the radio access network.
Right. Is this back to the look-aside and inline and all that stuff?
Well, whether it's look-aside or inline, there's a degree of customization that goes into it. So the latest Intel, Intel doesn't like the expression look-aside anymore. I think it's look-aside kind of
sounds too much like a energy drink.
It's too confusing to go into, but it's basically, the distinction between them is supposedly how much you're relying on the CPU rather than offloading something onto a custom bit of silicon that's described as an accelerator. But they're both doing it, whether it's look-aside or inline. You have a degree of customization to handle some of these really resource-hungry functions like forward error correction. And some of the other stuff that's going on with future 5G networks. Now, there's a forthcoming Intel product called Granite Rapids D that bundles a huge amount of acceleration and front-haul connectivity onto the same die that the CPU's on, and then that gets sold in a server. That's basically a very customized product. It's not the same kind of server that you would get Walmart buying to handle ordinary needs, ordinary kind of IT needs. And I just feel I mean, this is a point that was actually made to me by Nokia, because they very publicly come out and said they don't regard this as a general purpose processor anymore. It's basically it's basically a custom bit of equipment. So if it's a custom bit of equipment, then you're losing. You're either having everybody buying that, right? So which means there's a huge overhead because companies that don't have radio access networks are buying something that bundles in some kind of support for radio access networks and isn't needed, which implies there's some overhead. Or you're selling multiple options. You're introducing more on the menu when you're saying that something's a general purpose processor.
Yeah.
Which means that the economies of scale argument starts to suffer.
Yeah, totally. So it's a bit like what I was talking about before.
Yeah.
So the common theme is, is there, is this sort of generic approach to computing, whether it be cloud or whether it be chips, oversold? Because every time you say we've got a one size fits all, then you've got okay, but what about this, and this, and this, and then you need.
It's oversold.
I mean, another thing that's hilarious, example of how you need different chips to do different things. Firstly, if you look at a typical SoC now, a system on chip, which is basically the chips that you get in mobile devices, it used to just be talking about CPU and GPU, central processing unit, graphics processing unit, and I understood that the CPUs are great at serial, like inline calculations, one thing after another. Yeah. Graphics are great at a fatter pipe where you've got to do a lot more processing, but they're not so ideal for just everyday, like, I don't know, spreadsheets or whatever.
That, by the way, is the problem with the radio access network in layer 1, is that you need to do vector processing,
right?
Which is basically an array.
Intensive.
Yeah, it's like an array of calculations.
Yeah,
rather than just one thing at a time.
So that lends itself more to the parallel processing, which is more typical of GPUs, and that's why, for example,
that's why GPUs are quite good for the RAN.
And for example, that's why Nvidia, not Intel, is kicking ass with this AI boom. Yeah, because it turns out that parallel processing, I'm assuming, because Nvidia is the one that's making all the money, that parallel processing is better for AI training, large language model training than the sort of inline.
Although other people have products now that can do that, it's not like Nvidia doesn't have a monopoly on parallel processing. It just has. I mean, the main reason I think Nvidia's got a monopoly at the moment is not really to do with its chips.
It's CUDA.
It's the same reason that Intel has a kind of monopoly in general purpose processors, even though its chips probably aren't
the ecosystem around it.
A lot of people talk about the difference between the architectures, the RISC versus the CISC. You pronounce it that way, but reduced instructions of computing, of which ARM is the kind of the big designer versus.
And as we said on the podcast last week, there was an important moment where Microsoft is launching a bunch of laptops that are Windows on ARM. Yeah, it seems to feel it's finally cracked Windows on ARM, which is something it's been trying to do for 20 years.
And I think but it's not even just that. I think if you look at some of the stuff that's going on in other areas, including the RAN, so one of the concerns I've always had about Open RAN and virtual RAN is that this argument that it introduces more competition into the supply chain.
So let's quickly mention that. I'm just going to
bit weird when you're
going to point out that we've just got half an hour left. But while we're talking about that and your stuff, we might as well go on to the other.
Can I just tie up the
go on then.
Just bringing it back to the Unisuper thing very quickly, because that's. I mean, my story basically went on for a massive tangent to say why I don't.
It's not like us, is it?
No, to say why a lot of this stuff actually isn't really public cloud anyway. But if you come back to the last paragraph of that whole story, there's a really interesting. This is a report that the Bank for International Settlements came out with in 2022 that looked at the public cloud and some of the concerns that they had about it. And I think it's a brilliant sentence. And that for me is one of the problems I have with the public cloud. Just to read it out, it's growing reliance by a large number of financial institutions on technology services provided by a small number of big techs makes the continuity of those services systemically relevant. This dependency is forming single points of failure and hence creating new forms of concentration risk at the technology services level. Totally. I mean, basically, if you have, and this is the other worry for me, is that, people would say, well, the radio access network is very concentrated as well. And if there's a problem with Ericsson, it implies huge issues for lots of companies that use its equipment. Fair point, for sure, but it's more likely that you'd have specific base station problems, I think, or that one telco would run into issues with the hardware. If you've got instances of the public cloud or its support, and then we saw this with the outages with Akamai and other companies, is that multiple sites went down. Yeah. Now imagine that all the world's 5G core networks being hosted on 3 hyperscaler platforms. and they run into trouble. They run into
And as we've spoken
difficulties.
about loads of times before, it's not easy to switch between them. So you normally end up totally dependent on one of them.
Yeah, but imagine, let's say AWS has some kind of outage issue that doesn't only affect the AT&T network, but it affects a whole bunch of 5G core networks, and that's the problem. That's the systemic risk part of it, I think, is that these outages have already been shown to affect multiple sites when they've happened. So they can presumably also affect multiple 5G cores. Well, now, maybe there's more redundancy built in. I don't know. You were talking about.
Well, yeah, and I was just going to make a point about the redundancy. The problem with it is, and I'm sure if we had someone from any of the hyperscalers here, they have all sorts of reassurances to us about the fail safes and redundancy and backups and all that kind of shit they got, and I'm sure they do.
Well, and also I take the point that which Daniel Royston would come out with, is that a telco is more likely to fuck things up potentially than a hyperscaler.
Well, but then that's on them.
These guys, this is and I put that in the paragraph above. It's like a lot of people are kind of, the word that gets used, is the expression that gets used, is control freaks, isn't it? People like to drive rather than be a passenger. A lot of people, because they feel like they're in charge and it's up to them. And
and then if they have a crash, they've got no one else to blame. Yeah,
that's exactly the same thing. That's why I think a lot of telcos want to be involved in doing this themselves. It's the same feeling. It's the same desire to be the person that's doing it rather than allowing yourself to be guided.
So I'll make one last point about the redundancy side of things, which is more sort of human nature, which is basically
I prefer this. What is it?
That's the hazy one.
Good.
I still think Hazy Jane's slightly better. But anyway, it's just human nature, which is basically my big dilettante interest is psychology, and not just psychology, but sort of human systems. So maybe social psychology is what really interests me. And you think about incentive structures. So you made the point several times that one of the big incentives for moving to the public cloud is to save on overheads and to basically benefit from the economies of scale that the massive investment in data centers made by these hyperscalers has already done.
Yeah.
But then within those hyperscalers, while they've got some incentive to prepare for catastrophe and have some redundancy, there's always going to be downward pressure on overheads. There's always going to be pressure in any company to sort of salami slice things that are deemed a little bit superfluous. Yep. And it happens all the time throughout history. You get the salami slicing, and then the worst case scenario happens, and they've salami sliced all the fucking redundancy and the fail safes and all that, and then they're fucked.
Yeah.
So that's the concern, that for all the money, for all the enormous profits that those hyperscalers make, that's not, you never get to, like when at the start of my fiction book that I wrote, I basically mused on, why does someone who's already got shitloads of money, let's say they're a billionaire, why does someone who's already got shitloads of money want more? Because it's not about the money anymore. They can buy whatever the fuck they want. It's about poker chips. It's about a pissing competition. It's about ego. And so within a company, no matter how much money the company's making, there's always going to be individual pressure at various layers to increase margin, increase profitability, lower overheads. And that's what would worry me. Back to that excellent sentence from the Bank of International Settlements report, is it does. As soon as you create these bottlenecks where only 2, 3, 4 companies are basically running the whole fucking world, all it takes is for one of them to just not adhere to best practice, or one of them to have a rogue employee, or one of them to just be too concerned with short-term profiteering over fail safes and all that sort of thing, for it all to be catastrophic.
Yeah.
So let's quickly, because we haven't got much time, as quickly as we've been promising to do, you've touched on it a couple of times. You wrote one other story this week that you said got quite a lot of traction. And I believe you. I wasn't playing it in a so you claim way. Sometimes people get arsy. Sometimes people get arsy with that, where journalists write claimed. They think that's somehow excessively skeptical. Whereas I think anytime you're repeating anything someone else says, you have to say they claimed.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're stating it as fact, and you don't know it as fact because it's a received opinion. So anyway, so you claim this got loads of traction this week, and the headline is
they got a fair amount of traction.
Yeah,
it got shared quite a lot on LinkedIn, and it got good sort of stats on.
I'm just fucking with you. I have no doubt. So the headline is, and keep this one short and sweet because we're running out of time.
I will.
Open RAN sharing is the next possible blow to kit vendors. So what do you mean by that?
So this comes from a project that's going on in Romania at the moment involving Orange and Vodafone. And what they're doing is they're both having to sort of swap out Huawei.
Yeah.
And they've got this trial that's been going on for quite a while where they're sharing a network, which is not in itself new, like network sharing. But it started out, I think, in the old days as very much a passive thing, wouldn't it? Didn't it? You know, the kind of thing that you see MBNL and Cornerstone do in the UK, where you have the same masts, but you buy your active electronics separately.
So it's sort of site sharing more than anything else.
Site sharing, really, yeah. But you're not sort of sharing the same base stations and stuff. However, there has been a move to share base stations now.
And as you've had people like Cellnex get more into active kit as well.
Orange is incredibly advanced, apparently. They're saying 50% of their like RAN, I think, now across Europe shared.
With someone or other.
With someone or other. Now, so where does Open RAN come into this? Open RAN comes into it because apparently sharing even easier. And I think what the sort of rationale is that you can use the same radio unit, but then have separation at what we were talking about before, the kind of compute level. So you could basically put you can have different versions of the software.
Okay. And Open RAN facilitates that.
Open RAN makes it easier. You wouldn't be able to do that basically with a traditional RAN. You wouldn't be able to have different versions of the software like running over and connecting to the same sort of radio unit.
Okay, so this is a rare example of us flagging up a point that seems to be unconditionally in favor of Open RAN.
It's in favor of Open RAN. I'm not sure that it's in favor of RAN kit vendors. So in a way, it's good for operators because they can obviously realize more savings. Now, if this really advances and it goes, so by the way, Dean Bubley's quoted in this story because what Dean had been doing, he'd been at some event where he was going around talking to towercos, people like Crown Castle.
Was he asking his awkward Dean Bubley questions?
Well, he was saying that there is concern among some of these companies about the things like sort of centralization of what I was talking about earlier, that you can take sort of kit off the mast and put it into an aggregation point like a baseband hotel, because it implies that there's less need for space. And that's what they make their money from, basically, is renting out space on these facilities. But he said that the next concern for them is that operators might start to share radio units as well. Because if they're sharing radio units,
then it's a halving of the TAM,
then it's kind of halving the TAM. Now, if this is a bad thing for towercos and people like American Tower and Crown Castle, then it's by implication a bad thing for the people that make radio units, because instead of selling 2 radio units to Orange and Vodafone, you're selling 1 radio unit, and you might not even have the same. I mean, this is something I've not established, but I'm guessing this is the case: is that you could have those different software versions on the same bit of hardware, the same kind of server kit.
Right. Yeah.
You could deploy. And what Orange is saying is it could be different vendors there. So what you could theoretically have is Orange uses a Samsung radio unit with some Mavenir software, and Vodafone uses a Samsung radio unit with some parallel wireless software, let's say.
Yeah, but that's
not what's happening.
That's supposed to be the dream of virtualization and cloud, is that you can fuck around with things infinitesimally.
Yeah. What they're actually doing at the moment, by the way, in this Romania project seems to be all Samsung. It's a single.
Well, that's always the irony that you point out, is that they got this utopia about how you can mix and match, but then some of the realities of, for example, system integration and not having a million different vendors suddenly kick in, and you're like, do you know what? I'm just going to get one lot to sort it all out.
That's a negative for the kit market, because if it was Samsung doing the job, doing 2 contracts for Vodafone and Orange, where it provides different software versions to the 2 companies, and sells 2 radio units, one for Vodafone and one for Samsung. With this network sharing project, obviously, it's just selling 1 radio unit that they're both sharing. And now for Samsung,
hence your headline about a blow to kit vendors.
It's not a blow to Samsung, because Samsung doesn't have any market share in radio access networks.
Everything's a bonus.
So everything's a bonus, but it inevitably could, if it takes off, and if this becomes a preferred model and approach on a big basis, then it's obviously going to eat into revenues, because companies will be sharing equipment more and more rather than buying it separately. Yeah. Now, you could make the argument, which I think I did in the story, that it's better to have some kind of spend going on than none at all. And there's always this complaint that they're not investing. So maybe if they share and they're making some kind of investment, maybe that's a positive.
And it always depends which direction you're coming at. whether it's from a kit vendor point of view, from an operator point of view, from a consumer point of view.
Yeah, exactly. But I think potentially I mean, the telcos themselves are obviously doing this as a cost saving measure. They're obviously looking to reduce what they spend as a percentage of revenues, which by implication is not a positive thing for the kit vendors.
Totally.
And I think that's
who are having a tough enough
time as it is. And I actually think it's a really interesting use case. I mean, I get perceived to be quite negative about Open RAN, and I'm not. And I think this story shows that I'm not.
Yeah, so fucking calm down, everyone.
Because I wrote this up as this is actually a really interesting use case if you can do this. Now, one of the concerns, by the way, in the past was that I put this to Orange when I was sort of asking my questions, is that these radio units can only support so much bandwidth, yeah? I think the expression's IBW, instantaneous bandwidth, which is the total range that it can handle, like the channel. And so if you've got two sets of customers on one radio unit, issue. No. Yeah. And what their response was
shall I read it? There. Indeed, thanks to the containerization of network functions on
no, that's not.
They're losing me already.
That's not the bit.
Oh, I just thought.
If you go down,
Orange told like reading.
Down, yeah, there it is.
Oh. Orange, however, says this concern is now fading. That the RU supported bandwidth, in particular IBWs you just mentioned, may. I'm doing it because I haven't been doing much talking. I thought I need to remember how to talk. May have been indeed an issue in certain cases of RAN sharing in the 3.5 gigahertz, with large gaps between spectrum allocations of operators in the early days.
And then I paraphrased a bit.
Okay, with massive MIMO, a more advanced technology, you lead in, quote, antennas are not constrained anymore, allowing full bandwidth of both operators to be transmitted. So they're saying massive MIMO solves that problem.
Yeah, they're saying these radios are getting better and better, basically, and that this instantaneous bandwidth issue is going away, and that which holds. So this is only happening in rural areas in Romania. This kind of RU sharing thing that's happening, but.
Romania is a bit of a guinea pig for a lot of this dicking about, isn't it?
Well, it's a little bit like the UK. I think because in both countries they've had to replace Huawei, they sort of see that as an opportunity to do some trials and testing and see what.
Talking about replacing Huawei, I'm going to butt in if that's all right.
Yeah. Well, I mean that's pretty much that issue anyway. I think we've done it now.
I'm going to try their lager. It's my last one. So talking about replacing Huawei, I'm going to cover two or three ones of mine quickly because Ian's just fucking hogged it all the time. I channelized something from Reuters that basically reckons, and I did try and get confirmation of this direct from Nokia, but they were keeping stum, that Nokia is replacing Huawei as 5G RAN vendor in a Portuguese operator called MEO or MEO. I don't know what it is, but I think it used to be Portugal Telecom or something more.
Is it owned by Altice?
I believe it is, yeah. Altice, yeah. As part of that Altice, I think they bought it off someone else back about 2016. Anyway, the interesting thing about it, any change of vendor is always interesting. I mean, that's just an absolutely bog standard Telecoms.com or light reading story. You know, Ericsson replaces Nokia, Nokia replaces Ericsson, anyone replaces Huawei, whatever. That's always a story for us as telecoms business press, but this is obviously interesting because they're replacing Huawei. And actually, what I thought was most interesting about it, well, two things really. One, that Nokia got it, because Nokia, I don't think I'm being too cruel to say they haven't had a shitload of RAN wins that I'm aware of. Yeah, is that right? Have I got that right, or am I barking at the wrong tree?
I think no. I mean, Nokia's won a lot in Europe.
Okay, right.
So Nokia's done well my understanding is that Nokia's done very well in Europe.
All right, okay.
And they've benefited partly from.
Maybe I was thinking of the States
where they had issues clearly in the States where they lost a few years ago a contract with Verizon.
That's right.
And then they've
that big
AT&T thing last year. That's very bad, obviously.
Okay, so they're still doing well in Europe. In fact, one of the reasons I think they got this, which I'll lead into in a sec. Yeah, I'll get back to that. So a Nokia win alone was interesting, but then I thought it was interesting that here we are in mid 2024. By the way, talking about mid 2024, it's the 31st of May when we're recording this. Fucking feels like February outside. I want my money back.
Spring's gone. We've had it,
isn't it?
Last week.
Jesus Christ. I just come back from the Canaries,
Yeah, well, you're
and
feeling it
I've
more.
got
It's
this.
not cold, it's just wet and windy.
This going on. I got one of my winter hoodies on, for fuck's sake.
Hmm.
Anyway, um, here we are, mid 2024, and we're still talking about people replacing Huawei. So I did, to augment this Reuters journalism, I obviously did a bit of reading around and look for a bit of context and that sort of thing. And it was only back in about a year, almost exactly a year ago, that Portugal announced that they were getting on board with this fucking toolbox that the EU has, which is their way of going, get rid of all Chinese vendors.
Yeah.
Um, which, we haven't got time to talk about today, but we've spoken about it plenty on the pod before and probably will again.
I don't
How,
quite understand why they call it a toolbox.
because it's a euphemism. It's because they want to
It's
skirt
not a
around
good
it.
one though, is it?
Yeah, well, that's not a strength of theirs. Um, Here we are. Look, so here's a tweet from Vestager, who's one of the main EU commissioners a year ago. I commend Portugal. They've always got this supercilious tone. This is one of the things that antagonizes me about the EU. I commend Portugal's Cybersecurity Council for its thoughtful decision in implementing the EU security toolbox. Like it was a decision, like the EU wasn't going, you better fucking do what you're told, or you could say goodbye
Well,
to extra
this is
wedge.
interesting, isn't it? Because they're clearly not doing what they're told in Germany,
No, no, well, there we are.
and that's the
That,
big one.
that's the big one, and that's the one that I was just alluding to that we haven't got time to get into now. But it turns out Portugal is another one of the laggards, but now it seems like they're finally catching up. And so that was what was interesting about this story, is that Portugal was finally getting with the program. This isn't confirmed, by the way. Nokia wouldn't confirm or deny whether or not they are replacing them, but I've got a feeling that it is. It's just that Reuters got hold of an internal memo from Tommy Wito.
Right.
So it always makes you wonder when Reuters gets hold of an internal memo from Tommy Wito, you think, oh, I wonder how the fuck they got hold of that. Hey, Tommy. But whatever. I mean, that's fine. Leaks are part of our trade, so I'm certainly not going to criticize anyone for a sort of strategic leak. And they got some good coverage about it, and fair play to them. And one last thing I'd say is, a few years ago, what is it? I've linked to it. Nokia decided to create a new 5G and 6G research lab in Portugal. This is November 22. And it just seems that things like that might have paid off. I mean, there's a correlation causation dilemma there, but I'm sure doing things like that hasn't done them any harm.
Yeah.
And here they are. They're getting, assuming this Reuters story is true, they're getting this what remaining Huawei swap out stuff. They're getting some of that work from albeit a smaller satellite country, but it all counts, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So there's story number one. I'll move on unless you got any sort of further comment to make on that.
I mean, it's funny that the rhetoric sort of shifted so much, isn't it, over the last few years? Looking at that commentary from Vestager, however the name's pronounced, I know it's not pronounced that way, but I'm not going to attempt the Danish pronunciation.
We'll ask John when we see him in Copenhagen in a couple of weeks. He'll just go blah.
Yeah, you could never imagine that those sorts of comments being made back in 2017, 2018. When Huawei was sort of being welcomed, it seemed, with open arms in Europe, and how things have shifted so quickly is pretty amazing, really. It's that's scary.
The second part of her tweet that I didn't read out, which you may be alluding to.
Yeah.
She then goes, threats have no place
that's what I was
and will not deter Europe from legitimate measures to protect its critical.
Yeah, I mean, they just completely now regard Huawei, and they're not even disguising it anymore. I think you use the word euphemisms. There was a lot of this stuff going on in the early days, like use of high risk vendors, and people didn't want to say the name Huawei. It was like mentioning Voldemort and Harry Potter.
And now they're just like, fuck it.
And now it's just like everybody's kind of,
no, but
we don't want this company anywhere near European.
Well, and because geopolitically we take our lead from the States, I think. I mean, again, John would argue otherwise, and he bristles when.
Oh, look.
Yeah. So this is what I linked to. It's just to finish what I was saying there. He bristles when anyone, including me, who try and infer that the EU takes its strategic or its policy lead from the States. But what you were just talking about now. It's the States that have led the way in terms of being more hostile to China.
Yeah.
And I stressed again, I'm no China apologist. I'm sure a lot of it's quite justified. I'm sure they indulge in all kinds of industrial espionage. I'm sure they don't play fair in the WTO. I'm sure there's all sorts of fuckery that goes on.
No, but it's interesting your point about the states taking the lead, because our friend John Strand
That's what I was just saying.
push back, wouldn't he, and say it's very much.
I just said no. What are you fucking listening to?
Yeah, but his view about the EU kind of being its own master of its own fate, and is, I don't know, it just doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't ring true for me.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, you look at other things that are happening geopolitically. I was listening to a podcast. They were talking about the Israel situation. Don't worry, everyone. Pierre, least of all, I'm not going to get into that. But I learnt that Israel is the #1 recipient of US aid. People have aid budgets, which are basically bribe budgets. Yeah, we call them aid. Another euphemism. We call them aid, but it's a transactional thing. We give you this money, you do what you're told. So Israel's #1 recipient, and Israel doesn't do what it's told, but there's this sort of unique umbilicus between Israel and America. But then apparently, according to this podcast, the #2 recipients of aid are Egypt and Jordan.
Right.
And the way that was characterized by this expert that I was listening to was like, they're basically paying them to play nice with Israel.
Right.
So much of American foreign policy bribe money goes towards the Middle East, towards sort of mucking around with all that. The only reason I bring that up is, your point about it doesn't ring true that that US allies aren't more or less doing what they're told. And I'm sure it's not literally like that. But US is richer and more militarily powerful, and more culturally influential than any other country. So it just stands to reason that it influences everyone in its sphere.
The thing that doesn't ring true for me is that coincidentally, the EU ran about the same time that the US started to sort of, go after Huawei when Trump was there, and they started to make a real fuss about it. That the EU suddenly decided it was going to do the same thing.
Exactly.
That's the bit that doesn't ring
again. There's a correlation causation possibility there, but anyway. In the interest of time, I'll bring it back. So yeah, so Vestager was going, there's no room for threats, and then I linked to a light reading story written by Anne Morris, another excellent freelancer.
No relation to me.
No relation. Well, you have known her for a long time. Are you sure she's not your sister or something? You should ask. You should check. And her headline was China bristles over proposed Huawei 5G ban in Portugal. So China always does this. They've got a certain tone, and some of it might get lost in translation, but whenever someone does something that pisses them off, they adopt, talking about supercilious, they adopt a really haughty, supercilious tone. They go, we will not put up with this kind of mischief and troublemaking and wrong think and all that sort of thing. They really get their knickers in a twist. And then Huawei, I think on the back of that, what did they do? Yeah, they appealed the decision in the Portuguese court, but as I noted, they don't seem to have got very far. And this seems to be, if this story is true, seems to be the final denouement of that Huawei's presumably history from Portugal. So there's story one that I wanted to talk about, and then there's only one other that I've got time for that I thought was interesting. And I got to get some credit. I didn't credit them in the story because I reverse engineered it fully myself and got all the original sources. And my I don't know if you agree. My position on journalism is if you find out a story from another journalistic outlet, but then through your own research you're able to get all the primary sources yourself, I don't think ethically I'm obliged to credit that journalistic outlet just because they happen to be the ones that first flagged it up to me. So that's my approach.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? But as long as, I mean, like with that Reuters one, I tried to go to the primary source to Nokia. I didn't get anything, so Reuters gets the credit.
Yeah.
If with that Reuters one, I'd gone to the primary source Nokia and got confirmation from them, I might not have bothered. Just a dialogue between me and Nokia.
Yeah.
And so in this case, I'll shout them out, partly because we're about to be colleagues. This was Joe Halloran from Computer Weekly, is he?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I heard about it from him, but sorry, Joe, I didn't link to you in it because I then went and found all the primary material, which is why I didn't. But then I'm giving you a shout out now. I was just looking at the camera up there. I'm giving you a shout out now, Joe. So there we go. Anyway, and so yeah, I first saw it by Joe's reporting on Computer Weekly, and went and found all the documents myself. There's a thing called the House Commons Committee of Public Accounts, and this lager's all right, but it seems a bit gassy than the rest, so I'm a bit burpy.
That's the issue with lager.
Yeah, it is.
You're going to be burping your way through your description now.
Burping like a mofo. And basically, it published a report that's really critical of. I mean, the headline quote I took from it is it says, quote, public reporting of mobile connectivity across the UK is not fit for purpose, which is a very sort of UK sort of technocrat way of saying it's bollocks. And it's particularly
that's interesting.
Yeah, and it's particularly focusing on the shared rural network. Well, go on my story because I've linked to the primary source as well.
So they're saying that the connectivity figures that these companies come out with are kind of bullshit.
Yeah, well, I'll read some more extracts from it. So we're supposed to, by the end of next year, 2025, we're supposed to have achieved 95% geographical 4G coverage.
Right.
Yeah, so it's geographical, not population. And obviously, those last percents of geographical coverage are a real nightmare because you're just covering, a couple of sheep, and it's the economics of it are just a pain in the arse.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, that's what everyone's committed to politically and all that sort of thing. We're at 93%, but they reckon those last 2%, they can't see how that's going to happen. And here's a quote from the report. They said 3 of the 4 mobile network operators have already advised the department, by which it means DSIT, that they are each unlikely to meet interim obligations set by Ofcom to increase their own 4G coverage to 88% of the UK landmass by 30th of June 2024. So that's in a month's time. So in other words, 3 out of 4 of them aren't going to hit their own individual targets.
Yeah.
And the expectation is if they all hit 88%, then maybe in aggregate they'll get to 95%, I guess. And then it also notes that there's no publicly communicated plan for what to do about the remaining 5% that they're never going to try and achieve through the SRN. Presumably that will be like satellite or some other, or fixed wireless access or some other thing like that. Oh no, it wouldn't be fixed wireless access because this is mobile coverage in the first place. So I guess it just leaves satellite, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And like here's more of a quote I'll read from it. So public reporting of mobile connectivity across the UK is not fit for purpose, continues the report. Ofcom's data for measuring connectivity often does not reflect people's experience. People often experience worse coverage than reported because of local geography or building materials used within premises, like in this building. The department itself lacks information on whether mobile network operators are on track to meet targets to improve connectivity for road users and premises, and has insufficient data to judge whether connectivity on UK rail is improving. Now, I picked that as an opportunity to go off to sort of pursue a bugbear of mine, which is Ofcom having been repurposed to be more of a national digital censor than its traditional role of regulating communications networks, be they telecommunications or be they broadcast. And like, for example, I brought up one example that's been spoken about recently. There's a TV channel called GB News for non-Brits, or even for a lot of Brits, because it's not that well known. It's a new news channel, and it's basically more right wing than things like the BBC and any of the conventional news. Certainly BBC and Channel 4, but probably even ITV.
Yeah.
And it's always getting in the shit. And in my view, it's getting in the shit from Ofcom in a way that the other ones don't. Like they did a broadcast. The thing they got in the shit with recently, and what this BBC story that I linked to is about, is they got Rishi Sunak on, who's doing his very best to fuck up this election that we're coming up to. I mean, the announcement happened when I was on holiday. Well, he did it in the rain, and now he's going to talk about national service. I know
the Economist point is why now as well. It's like there's no plan behind it at all, really. It just seems bizarre, really.
Yeah, I think there is some rationale. I think a lot of it is to
the rationale being what? There's a slight improvement in the economy.
No. It's to sweep the rug out from under reform. So reform is, if again, I won't get into this, and partly because we haven't got time. Reform's a new UK political party that's basically coming at the Tories from the right, but they're quite new, they're quite underfunded, they haven't really got their shit together. And I think their grand plan was to surprise everyone and give everyone, all their opponents, not much time to prepare.
Well,
but they're going to lose.
They're the successors to the Brexit party, basically.
Yeah, UKIP, that sort of thing.
And I think there's less support for them now than there was a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I'd consider voting for them just as a protest vote, just because I couldn't vote Tory because they've been such fucking useless twats. But I'm not a big fan.
I mean, the point, because we're going to get cut off in a minute, aren't we? But one thing I'd say about your point that they're distracted by these things. I mean, I think in defence of Ofcom, we have to point out that they didn't used to be Ofcom; they used to be Oftel. Right, and this is a super regulator that got created.
So they keeps broadening.
Yeah. So I don't know whether the people who were looking at this stuff, who used to be in a different regulator, are necessarily chomping into the resources and the attention of the guys who are doing the telecom stuff. You know, whether it's
Well,
a different department.
I'll point you to a story I wrote at the start of this year.
You'd have to look
Ofcom,
at resources and all that sort of thing to establish that, I think. But
okay. I'm so pleased you asked about resources.
Okay.
Ofcom basically increasing its headcount by 50%, and all of those 50% are devoted to, quote, dedicated to tackling online safety.
Right, but it's still got the same number of people that do the telecom stuff as before.
But then if you look at and you're right, so they had about 1,000 before, and they're going to about 1,500. The new 500 all devoted to this censorship thing.
Yeah.
But then if you look at the Ofcom press site, or you look at press releases you get in your inbox from Ofcom, I don't know about you, I reckon the majority of them are to do with online safety rather than legacy responsibility. So it's not just a headcount thing, although I think that is illustrative. I just think their attention is gone that direction.
Yeah, but that's it might just be the off-tell people are just not putting as much stuff out, and they see less need to sort of be updating on this.
Totally, and I'll be the first to admit that I have a bias because I'm so twitchy about censorship and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, I use that as an opportunity to support my bias. Don't worry, Pierre, we'll be done in a minute. To support my bias and say, is one of the reasons Ofcom's fucking up on SRN because they're focused on censorship, and it could be bollocks. That's just me being self-indulgent, I admit it. Anyway, it came up with a bunch of recommendations what they should do, a lot of which involved Ofcom. And then I just finish off by saying, don't hold your breath. I mean, my main tone actually wasn't to bash Ofcom, it's just to bash this government and politicians in general. I just think they're all fucking useless. Yeah, I
mean, maybe one sign-off point is that I think these I spoke to somebody about this in the week who might actually be a good podcast guest in the future, but I'll talk to you about that afterwards. Sure. But he's involved in tracking sort of connectivity and coverage, and one of these kind of Ookla type competitors. But he showed me the tool they use, incredibly sophisticated. I mean, down to a kind of granular level of buildings and what you can. They're called M2 Catalyst, by the way, the name of the company. And I was really impressed. But they try and measure it based on a kind of quality threshold rather than just saying you've got coverage. What sort of experience the user's getting on that coverage? Because one bar on your phone saying you've got 5G will probably be taken by the operators as evidence of covering that area. But
the actual experience is rubbish.
So the actual coverage really isn't 80%. It's probably
more. It's like when T-Mobile US started talking about 5G, but it's all done over a tiny little strip of 600 megahertz.
Yeah, so it's useless. It's not a proper service. I think that's the problem.
Okay, cool. We'll wrap up there. We're going to be finally all back in the studio together next week. We're going to record that one a day early.
Got a guest on that?
No. Okay. No, we have got one guest coming up in about. Again, I hesitate to name them because then I don't want to embarrass them if they have to cancel at the last minute.
Yeah,
we've got one guest coming up, and then it's going to be all fragmented over the summer. We're all going off on holidays at different times.
Yeah.
So we'll just have to see how it goes. And we're talking about holidays. We've got to thank Pierre. I will wrap up now, Pierre, because he's on holiday right now, but he's taken time away from his family, although he's probably not been paying attention the whole time. Are you still there, Pierre? Can you hear us?
He's probably off drinking some red wine.
He's off having a bit of rosé. But he's taking time away. He's actually on holiday right now. He's taking time away to record this, so thanks a lot, mate. And yeah, I think I'll just wrap it up there and just say thanks a lot for watching, and make sure you join us for the next one.